I'm Nadira Tudor, and this is The Fall of Kabul, a soldier's story. Was it worth it? So I'm going to take you back to the moment that you realised that Kabul was falling that day. What were you doing and how did it make you feel?
I think, to be honest, I'm trying to remember exactly where I was. I can't remember, the exact place. I think I do remember being in the kitchen, sort of thinking, quite a lot about it. And initially, my initial reaction was one of real kind of frustration and anger, because I felt like absolutely sort of, one of those things where you just think this can't be real, this can't be happening. But yeah, I don't remember the place so much. I think about, stood in the kitchen, sort of seeing it on my phone or something, and just thinking this is, yeah, unbelievable. But my attitude, I think, has changed slightly towards it because you have to. I think yeah, it was something that initially just maybe just really, really angry and frustrated, but actually later on, I got to the point where I realised, this isn't anything to do with, this isn't on us. This is I think that certainly from my perspective as British Army, I think we did everything we could and we stayed as long as we possibly could. And it was actually after the withdrawal, the main withdrawal had already happened, and then, and then obviously it was only really when we'd already left that that the Taliban sort of started to really advance and take ground. So I feel like it was the way I've come to terms with it is looking at it as that this is on the Afghans themselves. We did everything we could, but at some point we had to step away and leave, and so they, ultimately, I think that they sort of didn't really take enough responsibility for their own country if they really wanted to keep the Taliban from taking the country over again. They probably could have if they were committed to it, but I think there was a lot of corruption, and I'm certainly not an expert, but that's the way that I've come to terms with it anyway. I deal with it by thinking, well, it's not on us. It was the Afghans have really, the Afghans have kind of made their choice there in a sense. I know that's maybe not a very nice way to look at it, but yeah.
You say you were frustrated and angry. They're two big emotions, really. Why were you frustrated?
I think it's because of the amount of, clearly the main purpose when we were there, there was a lot of purpose, there was a lot of reasons to be, in Afghanistan, but obviously the main sort of purpose as we saw it was to make sure that the Taliban were not in charge, and obviously we were very motivated to do that because, I remember reading there's a book, A Thousand Splendid Suns, about sort of that book has a lot in it about the way that women were treated under the Taliban regime and all that kind of. There's a lot. It felt like a really good purpose, a really good thing to be doing, to be there, and I think people were motivated to to try and keep the Taliban out of power, and that's what everyone kind of, I think, spent so much time and effort, and obviously people were horrifically injured and killed in the process of trying to ensure that they would not come back to power, and that they'd sort of and that the Afghan government would be strong enough to to sort of be able to hold elections and and keep the country stable, and then to just see all that sort of wasted, it just felt like a really big, I don't know, just a waste, really. Like, so what was, it did initially, and this isn't my point of view now, like I say, at the time I felt like, what was the point? It was, it was all a complete waste of time. But and lives and people's people's limbs, and the amount of the sacrifices that people made to try and ensure the Taliban weren't able to be in charge in Afghanistan. And it just was, and also it's not just that. I think it sounds a bit cold, but there's a financial element to it. As a country, we invested, I don't know, I wouldn't personally know any figure, but we invested huge amounts as a country in it in terms of everything, and then to have that wasted was, I think that, like I say, the only way for me to come to terms with it is to say we did everything we possibly could. We handed it over to the Afghans, and if they, weren't, if their leadership wasn't committed and motivated enough to actually, to keep things the way they were, then yeah, that's kind of on them, I think.
And you were angry.
Yeah, I mean, I think mostly angry with, at the time I felt angry with the Afghan National Army, because I'd worked with them a little bit when I was, I'd been on joint patrols with them and things, and, they did, at the time, I think they did sort of, everyone really did sort of think they lacked professionalism. They didn't have the same kind of level of professionalism on an individual basis or anything. They didn't seem to really care that much at the time as well, and that's why I sort of reflected back on that at the time and thought, why don't just? But actually, in hindsight, I think that it's got a lot more to do with their their leadership and their generals that actually were probably quite corrupt and were taking funding and rations for soldiers they just didn't have, and so they just weren't as fully manned as they were supposed to be. A lot of people just weren't, just weren't turning up, presumably. So yeah, I think, yeah, just angry that we've got so many people that have had their lives completely changed or ended, during that period. To be, I think I felt more angry on behalf of the families of people that didn't come back, because I felt like, how do you explain this to them? How do you explain to them that this was ultimately a sort of fruitless thing?
Did you feel like that? Did you have personal experience, I suppose, of losing people, and that made you feel like that, or watched people's limbs get blown off, for example?
Yeah, so I didn't. I mean, I think I was very lucky in that. So when I wasn't a photographer at the time. I was in the infantry when I served in Afghan, and I feel like I was very lucky because I know, I did know people that were killed, and I did know people that had terrific injuries. I didn't personally see anyone get anything worse. With my own eyes, I didn't see anyone get anything worse than a gunshot to the leg while I was there. So even though I think I was just lucky in that regard, because there were people in my own platoon that, sort of 500 meters away, for example, had double amputations and things like that from IEDs. But I was just very lucky that I personally didn't witness any of that. But yeah, I mean, I think back to people that I did know that were killed, and yeah, you just think, what sort of, it seems a bit senseless to just allow the country to just be overrun like that. It just, yeah, seemed pretty a bit senseless. But I feel quite lucky that I did come out unscathed, and I was part of one Rifles, the 1st Battalion of the Rifles, and we did have a lot of casualties. I'm lucky I wasn't one of them. I'm lucky I've come away from it with you know, with sort of no major sort of effects for myself. You know, if anything, it sounds really cold and kind of selfish. But for me personally, me and my wife saved money from tours in Afghanistan, which, you know, we've gone and got a house from. So it's like that is a very selfish way to look at it. But I haven't had any long-term effects. But I just know people that did, and it's more kind of on their behalf because But there's also I think there's also an element of sort of guilt in that respect as well, because I was quite lucky in that I was in positions where I could have easily have been killed, multiple times, and I was, sharing, I was in the same platoon as people that were, like I say, horrifically injured and some killed, and I feel like there's an element of guilt to that when you do look back, because I've moved on and it's like another lifetime to me now, because I've moved on so much. And forgotten about it almost, where I don't even really think about it much. I know that there's still people that are suffering the effects, so family members of people that were killed or people with injuries. I know that there are people out there that are still feeling that, and so that makes you feel a bit guilty sometimes. That you're like, well, I've just moved on, and kind of things are going pretty well for me, and I know they're not for other people. So that there's an element of sort of guilt there, really, I think.
There'll be psychological effects, though, won't there? You lived the aftermath, if you like, because if you lived within that platoon and worked within that area once people had lost their lives that you knew, there would have been some kind of effect. How was that? That's a life-changing experience in that situation.
Yeah, I think it's I don't know, it's interesting because you get. I mean, I remember very vividly when the last time I left. So we were on Op Herrick 14, which is the last tour I did. Afghan. We left our little patrol base where we'd been living and patrolled one last patrol back up to the main sort of patrol base. This is in Nara Siraj. So we had basically a little checkpoint that we've been living. We went up to the big main base where we were able to get a helicopter back, basically to Camp Bastion, and that would be the end of the tour. I knew from that point I got into the gates of that main patrol base. That was it. Sort of, I'd be okay. I was sort of, it was sort of over because at that point I was like, well, there's no more. There's no more time on the ground unless there's a very, very, very unlikely, scenario of something happening to an aircraft on the way back to Bastion. There's, which is almost unheard of. That would be safe. So I remember very vividly on the last few meters on the way towards the gates thinking, I've got my legs, I've got my legs, I've got my legs, because I knew people that didn't, have their legs and that were, that were very, that had their lives completely changed. And I felt like as long as I got through those gates for those last few meters, that was okay for the rest of my life. I've sort of made it. And so, yeah, that was a really strange experience to sort of feel like, and I got in there, I just felt like, I've just sort of like, I can't believe it, I've made it, because that's the main thing that people, I think, that was obviously the main, the sort of, the most obvious sort of thing to happen was, your legs were going to get blown off. And you'd sort of every day, every patrol, you've really felt like it could happen, at any point. And yeah. But I think one of the most striking things as well is it's not so much feeling, not so much thinking about yourself a lot of the time. For example, I do, a lot of the time I spent at the front of a patrol doing Vallon, where you use a metal detector to look for, explosives that have been buried. And when you're doing stuff like that, you don't really think so much about yourself. You worry about, if I miss something, there's a lot of people behind me, and so that obviously has a big impact on your kind of, on sort of having that sort of pressure of thinking, if I miss something, if there's something here, that I think has a long-term impact, because it's day after day. And I think it's I think it's one of those things that you kind of I think you do get used to risk. Like, people do normalize risk depending on their environment. They sort of, like, even if you lived in India and the roads were chaotic and you cross the road every day and you don't really think much of it, they just sort of get on with it, and they're like, well, that's just the way it is. People normalize whatever environment they're in and kind of tend to get used to risk and ignore it, get desensitized to it. So I think that's kind of that's sort of how it probably was being over there. But then you maybe afterwards you look at it and you go, okay, actually that was pretty sketchy, really, to be there.
Do you think that's had a long-term effect on you now? You're not looking for IEDs now as you walk around?
No, actually it is funny, because I don't think I have got any long-term effects or anything, but I do occasionally have some sort of like strange moment. Like, once in a blue moon, I have a strange moment where, for example, so if in the back garden I've got now, if I across my back garden, I can see through the fence to a building that's being built a couple of 100 meters away. And it was a couple of weeks ago that there was usually we don't see anyone working on the building. It was a couple of weeks ago that I kind of looked out of the patio doors, and there was someone on the roof of the building, and that was a bit like, I sort of had a strange moment where I felt like not secure. I felt like there's someone on the roof, like, because if you've lived in a little checkpoint, where everything outside of that wall is potentially dangerous, everything out there is a threat. And if there's someone up on a roof, you feel like that could be someone, that's it could be someone about to start shooting at you, and you feel like that. And that has an impact, I think, even years later. Just seeing someone random on a roof, I had a moment where I was like, what are they doing up there? Okay, it's a builder, they're building a house. There's nothing your sort of conscious mind obviously kicks in and goes, well, there's no issue there. But for just a second, you're like, what's that person doing on there? And I think I've tried to explain that to my wife before as well, because we had a situation where in my last house, she decided she'd get some window cleaners to regularly just sort of, just sign up to a service where window cleaners would come around sort of, I think, once a month, and they would, they just sort of come up to the back, come around the house and come up to the windows, and I think that for some reason we hadn't maybe discussed it enough. I'd got back from a trip, and I was sort of working just at the kitchen table. I think this was during COVID, and there was a guy just sort of came up to the back window and started cleaning it, and that made me feel I was extremely anxious about that. The idea that, because when you've lived, like I say, in that situation, being surrounded by a wall, everything outside of that wall is hostile, everything inside is okay, and that feeling of being very security conscious, where it doesn't, there's a line between outside is anything could happen, inside is safe. To have that sort of line blurred, for me, is something that I think is unusual to compared to maybe a civilian, because there is that complete kind of there is that complete sort of, it's black and white, secure and not secure kind of. You see what I mean? So I have noticed that about myself, which is a bit odd, but but yeah, I've explained it to my wife that really, to me, that's not something that I want to happen. I don't want people to just be able to wander into our house or around our house and start cleaning our windows without you know, me knowing, without them even knocking and saying, oh, I'm going to be cleaning the windows. That to me feels really wrong, which yeah is probably a bit of an effect. But yeah, apart from that,
It's also interesting the way that you've described making that final 100 meters, you know, with your legs. It's very vivid, your description. Do you think there were others like you walking down that little strip to the end and almost running in their heads, thinking, I really need to get to that point. I have to get to that point.
yeah, I think so. I think we didn't really. I don't think we really. I mean, I think might have mentioned it at the time when once we got in, I sort of said it jokingly to a couple of people. You know, oh, that's what I was thinking on that last bit, but we didn't really. Yeah, I think that other people must have been thinking something similar, but the sense of relief when you get to, you know, the end of a tour and you're just waiting for a helicopter to pick you up and just sort of, you know, you're kind of done, you've handed over everything is really, it creates a really nice atmosphere. You know, I remember there being just this, you get almost this kind of party atmosphere of like, you know, that's it, we're going home kind of. It was really, I think everyone was in the same boat, feeling real kind of relief. And yeah, so it is a nice yeah, it's a nice sort of feeling. There was like the tour before that, so we're up Herrick 9. I remember there was a point where we'd handed everything over, but there weren't enough helicopters to get us out sort of quick enough because, you know, they're always busy, they're Chinooks, and so they kind of there was a few days where we were just basically camping out at the edge of this little patrol base, just kind of like not really doing anything with no responsibility. We weren't patrolling anymore. We weren't doing anything. We were just sort of waiting for a helicopter to pick us up like a bus, basically. And just there was this really nice atmosphere of everyone just being kind of like so, you know, everyone was just so sort of relieved and chilled out. So it does everything has a kind of equal and opposite effect, you know, with so everyone has experienced that sort of sense of you know, it was had that all that hard work for that long, and then you sort of afterwards feel a bit like, you know, it's kind of almost like a party kind of atmosphere.
I've only experienced it on training exercises with the military, and I can't imagine what that must feel like in an actual conflict area. Because at the same time, I'm thinking that sense of relief. But you're not quite safe, are you?
Yeah, I think at that point there was, you know, in that particular scenario, there was very little kind of. I mean, obviously, there was a small chance that, you know, we could get some indirect fire into the camp or something, but there, you know, but that's, you know, the risk becomes minimal at that point. You know, it was patrolling. You know, it was patrolling outside of the base there was the real kind of, that's when you felt, you know, like something really could happen. I think psychologically as well, one of the interesting things that I noticed is that soldiers also really want to do their job. So it sounds kind of counterintuitive, but there was a point where, you know, there is a massive relief that people feel when they actually get to fire their weapon in, you know, in anger, sort of, if you like. When people get to fire their weapon for real towards an enemy, but there is actually a massive sense of relief and a big buzz that people get from that, because which sounds strange, but it's, I think, because the way I describe it is like a soldier's like a coiled spring. So they spend, depending on how their career's gone, you know, they could spend years and years and years practicing things over and over again, and they get coiled up basically like a, you know, like a spring, and they're doing drills over and over again to sort of practice what they would do in different scenarios, and you know, and on exercises, just mentally rehearsing things, and then when it actually happens for real, people really do get a big buzz out of it. And I remember when there was a point where we had quite a big, you know, quite a big contact, and I'd been firing Jeep MG, the general purpose machine gun, and from a Wimmick, so like a Land Rover basically, in the front of one of those, and we got back into camp, or into the sort of little patrol base we were living in, and me and this other guy were just sort of grinning at each other, just like, and we couldn't stop grinning about it because we were just like this, because there weren't any, there hadn't been any casualties, there hadn't been any, nothing had, nothing sort of, nothing negative had happened. We just felt like we had this massive sense of relief, like we've actually, like we've done it, sort of thing. Because there's just a big sort of, I don't know, there's like a sort of, I don't know, just a sense that you've worked towards something for a very long time, and then so when you actually get to do it, there's something quite good about that. And I actually feel that there's psychologically there might actually be more of an impact sometimes on someone who's been to that point, where they've been in danger and things through the military, but actually if they haven't had a point where they've actually been able to fire a weapon, they haven't felt like they've actually had any kind of like, maybe any kind of outcome that might actually probably be worse in a strange way.
It's a good point, I think, now to look at your journey and how you got to Afghanistan. Why did you decide to go into the military? And did you expect to be in that position ever?
I think at the point I decided to join the army, I didn't expect to be in Afghanistan, because it was, I'm trying to remember sort of how it worked, because obviously it was after 9/11. It was during the, there were troops in Afghanistan at that point, but I think what had happened was Afghanistan had very much disappeared from the media, because there was the initial thing of, oh, we're going to send troops to Afghanistan after 9/11, and then most of what the UK was dealing with was the north, where things were very stable and not actually, there wasn't much going on. And I didn't, I mean, I thought the way I explained it to my mum was joining the army would be mostly about peacekeeping, and and that's and being kind of, and that's sort of what people felt like that was what the army was for. In that sort of time, early sort of, really early 2000s. And then I did my first tour of Afghanistan was actually in the north, in Mazar-e Sharif, or near Mazar-e Sharif, where it was basically, there was no, there was very little actually happening to speak of. There were a few incidents that happened, but I wasn't directly involved, and it was over a 6-month period. There was sort of 2 kind of major incidents for an entire battalion. It was very quiet. And then at the end of that tour, we actually went down to Lashkar Gah, where in Helmand province, where the British Army were going to be, taking over from the Americans effectively. And we did our last month there in this very strange scenario where we knew it was a, we knew it was going to be very different down there, from what it had been up north, because we'd effectively been just patrolling around with our berets on, not even wearing helmets, not even, just with body armor, and your weapon was down by your side, and it was all very, it was all very calm. And then basically, so we finished that tour knowing that, okay, that was a bit strange around there, because there was more, we could tell that we were being watched more, there was more cars seeing us and speeding off, and a different atmosphere. And then we left, we went home, and it was the 16th Air Assault Brigade that had taken over from us, then obviously started the proper war-fighting phase against the Taliban then in Helmand province. And we were like, this is ridiculous. We were just there. We thought, this is amazing, because we had just been in that same place. But obviously it was before the proper sort of offensive had started, where they actually wanted to, really try and dislodge the Taliban from Helmand province. and so that was strange that we'd just been there, and so I just went. I It was then later on. So this was 2006, early 2006. I think it was then towards the end of 2006. I volunteered to go back on a short tour for a month and a half because they were looking for javelin operators. So I was in anti-tank platoon, so I was javelin missile basically trained. I went back for a month and a half to a completely different place, a completely different experience. You know, we flew into a oh god, what's it called? Sangin. So Sangin is you know, a small place in Helmand province where we basically flew in there, and I was just met with a scene that was entirely different from the one that we'd left, where it was, you know, people were living in really austere conditions. They were living off rations. This was a winter tour as well, so they were pale. They had beards. They were skinny. They were, you know, looked like they'd really been through a lot. And you know, I sort of me and my colleagues sort of arrived just like fresh from the UK. Like, what is going on? These guys had really been through, you know, a long time living in really austere kind of conditions. I remember we did like we do like a listening watch after. So basically, after we'd been on sentry duty, we had to just take a moment to listen to the ground, to listen for any signs of tunneling, because there was a threat that the Taliban would actually try and tunnel up underneath us and come in through the patrol base, which is a terrifying thought. Imagine someone appearing from the ground. You know, it never happened, but we had to do that, go through that that drill of listening to the ground at the end of every sentry duty, just to sort of see if we could hear anything. So that was obviously a completely different world from the one that I'd left before, which actually seemed quite, you know, again, it seemed quite sort of stable and peaceful initially, and then it was that, you know, once they started that kind of phase of real sort of, you know, war fighting phase, if you like, it completely changed. So yeah, I did quite a short period of time there because it was I was just basically put into make up numbers for a while, and then we went back as a whole battalion for Op Herrick 9, and that was my first sort of full 6-month tour where it was actually a, you know, a proper kind of a tour where there was a lot going on, and it was a full 6 months, you know. So that was yeah, it was, I think, I'm trying to think what dates that was roughly, but we were kind of 2008, 2009, I think, roughly. So it's, yeah, but it was another winter tour. I think one of the things that people might find surprising is how that it was sticky, kind of like sticky mud a lot of the time in the middle of winter. It wasn't like people imagine Afghanistan as being like this hot desert all the time, and it was horrifically hot in the year in the summer, but the middle of winter really was kind of wet, not that cold, but like just everything was just constantly muddy, you know. And so you're kind of like, you know, this, you see it on memes where people sort of say experiences may vary about Afghanistan. You know, the real kind of like some of the places that I, you know, had to sort of live in, like on Herrick 9, we had an observation post, which basically a hill where we were using to observe, you know, basically keep a sort of watch in the area, and we'd sort of do about 2 days on, 2 days off on that. So when we were up on that hill, we were basically effectively like living in a hole, pretty much. Like it was kind of a dugout sort of thing that you'd expect to see from World War One. You know, we were just kind of, it was just really kind of basic conditions, you know, that you'd imagine, you know. And there's so many people that kind of, I know, lived in more built up bases in Afghanistan that I sort of, you know, there's always an element of kind of like rivalry, like wanting to tell people like I wasn't living in Camp Bastion where I had my laundry done for me. You know, we were hand washing, we were eating rations, everything was muddy. It was, you know, it really was. You know, I think there's definitely a lot of rivalry that exists between, you know, people that kind of had the proper experience and and those who didn't. But yeah, so during that tour we would do about 2 days on there, and then 2 days roughly where we'd be on the Wimix, so on the big sort of Land Rover things, driving around and basically patrolling in support of the guys that were on foot. And that's where I kind of had the first experiences of, you know, firing, you know, a machine gun at, you know, at living human beings, I suppose, which is a, you know, horrific kind of thing to say, but it's like it's a bizarre, yeah, it's a bizarre thing to think, you know, that, you know, so many of us have done that and just sort of then go on to live normal lives. It's really, it's a really strange idea. But that was so the first sort of major contact I had was with we were driving along a sort of a narrow path with a sort of cornfield on one side and just a wall on the other, and we kind of came out into this open area. There was a massive sort of open field, and about 400 meters away there were some trees, and you could just see some sort of little dots really at that distance. It's, you know, barely that people are just sort of dots sort of running along, and we were like, what's that? That's a bit strange. Like who's that running? And then you suddenly hear this, you know, huge cracking noise around you. Obviously they're firing, and then it is just like an exercise. You just start, you know, you fire back, and you can't really see what you're firing at properly, because you just, like I say, over that distance, it's just, you know, they're just sort of little dots. But then, and you can't really see what effect you're having. But you know, you just, I remember this the sergeant sort of just sort of coming over to the side of Land Rover and putting his hand on my shoulder and going, yeah, that's good, like as in that's accurate fire, you know, because he could see maybe a little bit more clearly than I could. So yeah, that was the first sort of experience of that. And then afterwards, like I say, that you feel like that actually a kind of sense of relief that actually something's happened, because I think that people dread the idea when someone's in the army and they've gone through all that training and all that preparation, you know, and all that pre-deployment training. The thing that I think most soldiers dread the most is the idea that that something will go, that you know, they won't be able to perform their sort of function in reality. You know, they'll be shot at, and for whatever reason, they won't be able to, you know, they'll freeze, or they won't be able to fire back, or something will happen that will stop them from, you know, from doing their job, basically. And so I think there's a massive sense of relief that everyone felt, you know, just like, because it's this build-up of tension, because everyone feels like, how am I gonna feel? How am I gonna act if it happens for real? And everyone's worries about that through probably their entire career. And then when it happens, it's like, okay, I've done it, you know. So that's a really strange thing, but I think it's true for most people. But yeah, and then we had a few sort of similar incidents, I suppose, through that tour, and yeah, there was, yeah, it was kind of a bit of a strange one, because it kind of, everything quietens down in the winter. There's really not that much happening in the winter, and then as it got warm again, there was a few more kind of things like that, and then we, yeah, basically came back. Went back to the UK for about 18 months, and then went back out on Herrick 14, so another tour, where I was doing a very different job that time, because I was on foot, you know. I was part of a just what you call a multiple, you know, soldiers on foot So I wasn't doing that support company role that I've been doing before, where we were just doing fire support on Herrick 9. This was more kind of just part of a normal infantry multiple. And that was, I think, it was strange because one of the things I remember is getting towards the beginning of the tour, when we had, we knew that stuff was going to start happening, because it was going to be a summer tour, which meant that as it went from winter kind of into spring, there was going to be a lot more Taliban activity, because they would be a lot more active as the weather got better, basically. So towards the beginning of the tour, as it started to get warmer, I got D&V basically. So I was in this checkpoint, and I was completely isolated. So it was like, obviously we can't let that spread to the rest of to everyone. So you had to, I had to just sort of isolate myself and just keep myself away from everyone, and not, and I felt at the time absolutely awful, because it was like, I felt like the others were going to go out and kind of do their job and get to sort of, kind of feel that sense of being there for a purpose and doing their job and fulfilling what they were there to do. And I thought, even though it's for such a short time, it was only a few days, I felt really sort of useless at that point. And I was like, because you feel bad when you're ill anyway, but to be ill in that situation where you're letting other people go off and do these kind of things and you're not, that was really really awful. But yeah, obviously it was a very short run thing, and that tour was it was interesting because there wasn't it was slightly less of a I don't know, the way that we were operating, I think, in Afghanistan had changed a lot anyway, because there was a period of, like I said earlier, I shouldn't say that, there was a period of the war fighting phase where the Paras initially went into Helmand province, and then they were really trying to kick out the Taliban, and it was really, they were treating it like a conventional war. By Herrick 14, we got to the point where it was like, this is not a conventional war. We need to show what they were calling courageous restraint. So basically, someone fires at you, you don't necessarily have to fire back with everything you've got, because that person you're firing at is potentially someone's son, someone's brother, and then all you do is you turn that family against you. So effectively, from that sort of phase in the conflict, they were talking more about, how do we be a bit more clever about this, because we're not ever gonna defeat the Taliban by a sort of attrition. It's not going to go away. All we're doing is effectively, we're just recruiting for them, because every time someone gets killed, they're probably just some poor young farmer who actually isn't really the enemy. The enemy is actually the sort of the bosses and the higher up people within the Taliban, who really all they're doing is paying these poor kids to pick up a rifle or make an ID or whatever they're doing. They're not really the enemy, and actually those people could probably be brought on side. So we started to talk more about attacking the network. So how you, rather than just firing at someone because they're doing something they shouldn't be, getting in air assets to watch them and see where they go, see who they talk to, follow people, detain people. And we were using things like X-spray, I think it was called at the time. So you'd swab people's hands for explosives, for example, like they do at an airport, and things like that, where we were very much more, it felt a lot more like we were doing things the right way by that point, because it felt like before that it was all a bit like, I think a lot of people just sort of wanted to have their war, and it was all a bit kind of wasn't really being done, probably conducted in the right way. And then now at this point, people were starting to do things a bit more cleverly and think about, well, how can we actually bring this to a successful conclusion? We were, like I say, patrolling with the Afghan forces. We were, and basically trying to get them to try and get them to take as much responsibility as possible as well. So that by that point, which is I think where the anger initially came from when Kabul fell to the Taliban, because I thought those guys, they haven't, perhaps they didn't put up a strong enough resistance to the Taliban.
Did you make friends with the Afghan National Army? How did that work for you? Did you build relationships?
Yeah, so I was lucky enough to go on a language course actually before. So before Herrick 14, I was on a 10-week Dari course. So, I basically had the sort of job within the multiple, because I'd done that course, of trying to build that sort of good relationship with the Afghan National Army. We were sharing a camp with them. So I did sort of unofficially, I had the task of trying to build that relationship, and it was ironic because a lot of them were actually not recruited in the north where they speak Dari. A lot of them were more from the south, and they didn't really. So I actually wasn't. The course wasn't much help in the end, but I still, made an effort to. There was a couple of them that could speak Dari, and yeah, I did. I mean, I can't remember any specific names, but I did. I was friendly with them, and I was, yeah, there was like one specific guy who he was I think he was like their chef, and he tried to explain in the best way he could. We sort of basically we managed to communicate really clumsily, and he explained his story was that he was from Kazakhstan, and he'd basically got chased away from his village by an angry father because he'd been seeing a girl he shouldn't have been or something, and then he'd basically run away to Afghanistan, and he'd joined the military, and he had this really sort of crazy story, and he ended up as a chef in the ANA. But yeah, so yeah, I mean, I do think that we did sort of get on, but a lot of the time it was just a communication issue, because obviously you had interpreters, but I think the interpreters, things are never really, it's really hard to build a strong relationship via an interpreter. I think with someone, I personally, I don't think it, I don't think we were that close or anything.
How do you feel now, or how did you feel about the Afghans once Kabul fell back to the Taliban?
I think I did feel a bit, I felt sort of let down. That sounds strange, but yeah, let down, because I do think, we did try to kind of. I think I probably felt a very strong connection to that country, because I'd spent. I think in total I was back and forth, multiple times, and I think in total I probably spent about 2 years over there, or maybe more. So I felt and I'd done the language course, like I say, and so I think, yeah, I just felt a very strong connection to Afghanistan as a country. And then it's weird because I think from that point when the Taliban took over, it's almost like that connection has kind of gone. I felt like that was somewhere like, because I had thought that, one day maybe we'll go back and on holiday and sort of and go and visit places, because I thought, if we can return to the Afghanistan of the 1960s, and where people could travel fairly freely, I thought maybe one day there'll be battlefield tours like like in Vietnam, where we could go back and see some of these places, and I did feel that kind of like almost like it would be a welcoming, like a familiar welcoming place in years to come, when I was older. And then I felt like that was just sort of cut away, and like it was somewhere I didn't feel any connection to anymore.
How do you feel that you might never be able to go back and see those places?
I don't know. It's strange because I don't. Yeah, it doesn't bother me particularly that I can't go back. It's just I feel a little bit almost feels a little bit like a betrayal, because it's sort of, it seems like, I know that there are huge numbers of people in Afghanistan that would still absolutely, that are suffering under the Taliban, and that would do anything to try and change it. But I just don't feel like there was enough, organised resistance to them, and it just feels like a bit of a betrayal in that sense, that like, we spent all that time trying to kind of help stabilize the country, and it just doesn't feel right that people maybe allowed it to happen. I'm not an expert. I don't, on in terms of the political situation over there, so I can't, I can only speak from my own feelings, really, that they must have sort of allowed it to happen in some way. So yeah.
So if I come back to asking that question, whether you feel it was worth it, what's your answer to that?
Oh God, yeah, it's difficult, because I think in some ways, yes, it was, because I think that if it's better to try to do the right thing, even if you end up failing, even if it doesn't work for whatever. It's still better to attempt, to do the right thing, and to, there was still a lot of people for that period of time that we were in Afghanistan, where Kabul did become particularly sort of stable, and was very, it was, at one point, a very, a vibrant place where people could, where there was a lot of people getting educated, a lot of, girls getting educated, and doing things they weren't able to do before. I think I still think it's worth it to try and do a good thing, even if it doesn't last for, forever. Because you've just got to try, haven't you? So it's, yeah. I wouldn't like, because I don't like the idea that it wasn't worth it at all, because that just sort of disregards any progress that was made, or any kind of, any sort of, for any girl, for example, that managed to go to school and university during those years in Afghanistan. That's still a benefit. They've still got that education, whether they're allowed to use it or not, or whether they're, there's still a lot of people that essentially benefited a lot from us being there. So I don't think it's a complete waste. But yeah, I think there's definitely it's like that sort of, it's not the critic that counts sort of thing, isn't it? That kind of, that it doesn't, whether even if it's a complete failure, at least we tried, and did everything that we possibly could. So yeah, I think it was worth it in only a small amount. But yeah.
Thank you for joining us on The Fall of Kabul, A Soldier's Story. For more episodes and in-depth exploration, visit us on YouTube and on podcast streaming platforms.